The hidden place. The bookshelf had been in Ethan's room for as long as he could remember, but he'd never noticed the gap before. It was barely visible, just a sliver of shadow between the oak frame and the wall, no wider than his hand. He only spotted it because his phone had slipped behind the shelf during a late-night scrolling session, and when he'd pressed his face against the wall to peer into the darkness, he'd seen it, a space that shouldn't exist. The kind of impossible gap that made his stomach twist even though he couldn't say why. That was Monday. On Tuesday night, Ethan woke to the sound of breathing. Not his own. He was holding his breath, frozen beneath his covers. This breathing was wet, labored, like someone drowning on dry land. It came from the direction of the bookshelf. He squeezed his eyes shut, told himself it was the radiator, the house settling, anything but what his lizard brain was screaming at him. When he finally forced himself to look, his blood turned to ice. There was something leaning out from behind the bookshelf. A head, smooth and pale as a fish belly, webbed with angry red veins that pulsed in the moonlight. It had no face, or rather, it had too much face. Where eyes should be were shallow indentations, and below them, a mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth that curved inward like a lamprey's maw. It was just watching. Leaning out from that impossible gap, head cocked at an unnatural angle, pointed directly at his bed. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't scream. He lay there for what felt like hours while the thing simply stared with its eyeless face, its chest rattling with each soggy breath. When he finally blinked, it was gone. The gap behind the bookshelf looked no different than before. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. Wednesday, Ethan tried to tell his mother, "There's something in my room," he said over breakfast, his hands trembling around his orange juice. She replied, scrolling through her phone. "Did you use that lavender spray I got you? It's supposed to help with nightmares." "Mom, I'm serious. Ethan, I have a meeting in 20 minutes. We'll talk about this later, okay?" They didn't talk about it later. That night, he stared at the bookshelf until his eyes burned, determined to catch it if it came back. He'd pushed his desk chair against the gap, wedged it tight. Nothing could squeeze through now. Nothing. At 3:47 a.m., the chair began to slide. Not quickly. That would have been a mercy. It scraped across the hardwood floor, one agonizing inch at a time, pushed by something behind the shelf. Ethan watched in horror as pale, skeletal fingers emerged from the gap, each one too long, too many joints, wrapped around the chair leg. The hand was slick, glistening like something pulled from deep water. The creature emerged slowly, savoring his fear. Its head came first, that terrible blank face now splitting open to reveal its spiraling teeth. Its body followed, impossibly thin, dressed in what looked like a rotting formal suit that dripped with brackish water. When it finally stood fully in his room, it had to hunch beneath the ceiling, its spine bending at angles that made Ethan's eyes water. It raised one dripping finger to where its lips should be. Shh. Then it began to move around his room, touching his things, running those two long fingers across his baseball trophies, his laptop, the photo of his dead grandmother on his desk. When it reached his closet, it opened the door and stood there, swaying slightly, breathing that horrible wet breathing. After an eternity, it turned back to face him, and it laughed, a sound like meat being torn apart. Then it retreated behind the bookshelf, folding itself back into that impossible space, and was gone. Thursday, Ethan went to school with a hammer in his backpack. He couldn't explain why he'd taken it from the garage. Protection, maybe, or maybe because some part of him already knew what was coming. His teachers commented on the dark circles under his eyes. His best friend asked if he was sick. Ethan just shook his head and clutched the hammer tighter. That night, he nailed boards across the gap behind the bookshelf, 6 of them, driven deep. His mother would be furious, but he didn't care. She wouldn't understand. No one would understand. He fell asleep at his desk, the hammer in his lap. The splintering woke him. The boards were breaking, one by one, from behind. Not being pried loose, being pulled apart, wood shrieking as it gave way. Ethan grabbed the hammer and backed against his bed as the creature emerged through the wreckage, its body passing through the space like water through a grate. Tonight, it didn't just watch. It came for him. Those skeletal hands grabbed his ankle, and the coldness of its touch went bone deep. It dragged him toward the gap, toward that impossible darkness behind the shelf, and Ethan screamed and swung the hammer. The blow connected with the creature's head, and there was a sound like wet clay breaking. The thing released him, reeling back, and for just a moment Ethan saw fury in its eyeless face. It opened its mouth wider than any mouth should open and shrieked, a sound that made his nose bleed and his teeth ache. Then it was gone again, retreating to its hidden place. Ethan sat on his floor until sunrise, gripping the hammer, waiting for it to come back. It didn't, but he knew it would. Friday, he stopped going to school. He stopped eating, stopped talking. His mother threatened to call a therapist, but her words seemed to come from very far away. Nothing mattered except watching that gap, waiting for nightfall. He'd covered the space with every holy symbol he could think of: a cross, a Star of David, a Hamsa hand he'd ordered online. He'd sprinkled salt. He'd burned sage until the smoke detector went off. None of it would matter. He knew that now. The thing behind the bookshelf wasn't bound by rules he understood. When night fell, he was ready. The creature came as the clock struck midnight, unfolding from the darkness like origami in reverse. But tonight it was different. Larger, more solid. The veins on its head pulsed brighter, and its suit was less rotted, almost clean, as if each night it spent in his room made it more real, more permanent. "What do you want?" Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. The creature's head tilted. It raised one hand and pointed at Ethan. Then it pointed at the gap behind the bookshelf. Then it smiled, a real smile this time, lips where there had been none before, forming in the pale flesh like wounds opening. "It wants to trade places," Ethan realized with cold certainty. "It wants out, and I'm the price." The creature began moving toward him, steady and patient. There was nowhere to run. The door seemed miles away, and even if he reached it, where would he go? It had found him here, in his room, in his safe place. It would find him anywhere. As those dripping hands reached for him, Ethan made his choice. His mother found his room empty Saturday morning. The bookshelf had been pulled away from the wall, leaving deep gouges in the floor. Behind it was just blank wallpaper, no gap, no space between the shelf and wall. She would later swear it had always sat flush against the wall. There had never been a gap. Ethan's laptop was open on his desk, a single browser tab still active. How to tell if your house is haunted. His bed was made. His clothes were folded. Everything was normal, except he was gone. The police searched for 3 weeks before quietly closing the case. Runaway, they decided. Troubled kid. There were others like him, kids who just vanished from their rooms in the night, leaving no trace. In her grief, Ethan's mother sold the house. The bookshelf stayed, passed along to the new owners. They had a daughter, 12 years old, who claimed the room as her own immediately. She loved the old bookshelf, loved running her fingers along the spines of the forgotten books left behind. On her first night in the house, she thought she heard breathing. Sometimes late at night, people swear they hear tapping from behind the old bookshelf. A desperate rhythm, like someone trying to signal from very far away. But when they look, there's nothing there. Just a gap, barely visible, no wider than a hand, between the oak frame and the wall. A space that shouldn't exist. And deep in that darkness, if you pressed your face close enough, you might see pale fingers gripping the edge from the other side, trying to claw their way back out. But by then, it would be too late. The thing that wears Ethan's face is already standing behind you, dripping and grinning, reaching out with hands that have too many joints, and it's finally learned to be patient.